Last time we spoke about the Russian Civil War. In the aftermath of the Russian Revolution and World War I, the Russian Civil War ignited, leading to a struggle for independence amongst various nations within the former empire. As the Bolsheviks seized control, they faced opposition from the White Movement and various nationalist groups. Ukraine, for instance, saw bloodshed between the Red Army and White forces, compounded by external influences from Germany and Poland. Similar turmoil unfolded in Belarus, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, each grappling with their own sovereign destinies amidst Russian turmoil. Throughout these conflicts, the Red Army emerged as a formidable force, gradually professionalizing through strategic leadership and collaboration with Germany. Ultimately, the Soviet government established a new order, although its grip on the territories remained contested and fraught with violence. The Civil War's sweeping changes resulted in millions of casualties, and the birth of new nations vying for their own identities against the backdrop of a collapsing empire. This episode is the Reichswehr. Well, hello there. Welcome back to the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II and so much more, so give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War, my podcast series found on all major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I recently released a rather wacky episode looking into the crazy world of Chinese World War II dramas. And over on Echoes of War, I'm now releasing a 5-part series covering the Malayan campaign of World War II. If you'd like to further support me, consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Well, hello again, and welcome to the third Prelude episode, where we're going to be looking at the development of the Reichswehr during the Weimar Republic. In the autumn of 1918, Germany was a nation in turmoil. The Great War had taken a horrific toll, leaving millions dead and a landscape of Europe altered forever. As the war dragged on, the German populace grew weary and disillusioned. The country faced food shortages, economic deprivation, and increasing unrest. Battles raged at the front, and the whispers of revolution began to echo through the streets of cities like Berlin and Munich. In late October of 1918, the German Navy, facing certain defeat, mutinied against their commanders in Kiel. It began with a group of sailors refusing to set sail for a final engagement with the Royal Navy. This act of defiance sparked protests and unrest, quickly spreading to various sectors of society. Workers and soldiers united, demanding an end to the war and a change in government. On November the 9th of 1918, amidst all this upheaval, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated. The announcement sent waves of excitement and relief through the streets of Berlin, as crowds celebrated the end of the monarchy. However, this was only the beginning of a much more complex struggle. Two main factions emerged in the revolutionary landscape: the Social Democrats, or SPD, who sought for a parliamentary democracy, and the more radical Spartacist League, led by those like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, who advocated for a socialist revolution. As the new government took shape, the SPD formed a coalition with moderate left-wing groups. They declared a new republic, known as the Weimar Republic, on November the 9th of 1918. With Friedrich Ebert as its chancellor. Ebert's government faced immediate challenges, including the need to maintain order and appease the demands of workers and soldiers who sought significant reforms. Strikes and protests became commonplace. Workers' councils, or Soviets, were established across the country, asserting their influence over social and political landscapes. In response, the SPD sought to suppress the more radical movements. The Spartacists, unsatisfied with the pace of the reform, initiated their own uprising in January of 1919, believing that a true revolution was necessary to secure a socialist future. The Spartacist uprising, however, was met with violent resistance. The government decided to quell the insurrection by enlisting the help of the Freikorps, paramilitary groups made up of former soldiers. We will get into them a little bit more later. Over the course of the uprising, brutal clashes ensued in the streets of Berlin. The Freikorps, driven by a mix of anti-communism and nationalist fever, clashed with the Spartacists, resulting in significant bloodshed. On January the 15th of 1919, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg were captured and they were murdered by the Freikorps. Their deaths sparked national outrage and further polarized the political landscape. The radical left realized the urgency of their cause, but their leaders were gone, so the movement fractured under the weight of the government repression and internal division. The entire crisis had narrowly been averted when Chancellor Ebert reached an agreement with the army quartermaster, General Wilhelm Groener. The details of this pact remain undocumented, while only Groener's account is available today. He asserted that he offered Ebert the army's backing on the condition Ebert would take steps to suppress early strands of communism within the military and ensure a peaceful transition of power. This arrangement helped stabilize the nascent republic during its early days and was referred to as the Ebert-Groener Pact. Now I think it's important to talk a little bit about the German armed forces after World War I. The remnants of the Imperial Army were divided into two main factions, those stationed on the Western Front and their counterparts on the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front in particular required urgent attention as new states, some having not existed for centuries, suddenly emerged in this chaotic post-war landscape. German volunteers, organized similarly to mercenary companies, roamed the battlefields of Eastern Europe. These groups were known in German as die Freikorps, as we had mentioned briefly before. The Freikorps participated in nearly all the independent struggles within what were formerly the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires, though they rarely played a decisive role due to their limited numbers. However, they definitely served as breeding ground for several future Nazi leaders, including Heinrich Himmler, Reinhard Heydrich, Martin Bormann, and Richard Walter Dada. The Freikorps were not simply mercenaries engaged in Eastern European conflicts. In 1919, they fought on behalf of the government to suppress various uprisings and efforts to establish independent territories within the former German Empire. The most significant of these was, of course, the Bavarian Socialist Republic, which lasted about 3 weeks before being dismantled by about 30,000 Freikorps fighters under the orders of the Republican government. However, by 1920, the situation had shifted. The distinction between the military and the Freikorps had blurred, as many Reichswehr officers also led Freikorps units. These officers viewed their allegiance to the state as a fragile bond, maintained only when their interests coincided with those of the state. For those of you who listen to my Fall and Rise of China podcast, they are very much akin to the private armies during China's warlord era. While the troops are officially part of the KMT, the National Revolutionary Army, aka the NRA, thus the federal troops of the nation, many were also being paid by regional warlords, take Feng Yusong or Yan Qishan for example. Thus, such troops owed loyalty to a warlord clique and their nation. Now back to our story. In early 1920, tensions escalated when the German defense minister, facing the growing power of the Freikorps, ordered the disbandment of 2 of their units stationed in Berlin. This decision was met with fierce opposition from General Luttwitz, a Freikorps commander who refused to disband his men, and he felt that loyalties to the Republic were tenuous at best. Instead of obeying orders, Luttwitz rallied his forces, believing that the government's attempts to disband these troops threatened the very stability of the nation. In a bold move, Luttwitz called upon the Freikorps to march upon Berlin, igniting what would soon be known as the Kampf Putsch. For those of you not aware, a putsch is simply the German word that closely resembles the French term a coup d'etat. On March the 10th of 1920, thousands of Freikorps soldiers seized control of key government buildings, overpowering the police and military resistance. As the Freikorps advanced, chaos spread through the city. The civilian government led by Friedrich Ebert found itself under siege, with officials forced to flee for their lives. Ebert's government sought to maintain order and authority amidst the upheaval. In a desperate attempt to regain control, he called upon workers of Berlin to initiate a general strike. This call resonated deeply with the people. They understood that if the Freikorps succeeded, their rights and livelihoods would be at risk. Across the city, factories halted production and trains stopped running. Within days, a wave of solidarity brought the city to a standstill. The general strike took its toll on the Putschists. The Freikorps, despite their military training and discipline, found themselves unable to manage the unyielding opposition from the workers and citizens, determined to protect their fledgling democracy. On March the 17th, just a week after the rise of the Putsch, the tide shifted dramatically. The coalition of workers, united by their strike, weakened the Freikorps' grip on the city. Realizing they could not sustain their hold in the face of growing resistance and the collapse of basic services, Lüttwitz and his allies decided to abandon their quest for power. In a hasty retreat, he fled to safety, aided by sympathetic police who had been sworn to serve the Republic. By the end of March of 1920, the Abort government re-established itself in Berlin, having narrowly escaped a coup that could have thrown the nation into deeper chaos. Though the Putsch ultimately failed, it exposed the fragility of the Weimar Republic and the dangers posed by paramilitary groups like the Freikorps. As the dust settled, the events of the Kampf Putsch served as a stark reminder that democracy was under constant threat in post-war Germany, foreshadowing the larger crises yet to unfold in the years ahead. In the aftermath of World War I, a young Austrian man named Adolf Hitler was struggling to find his place in a drastically changing world. Having enlisted in the Bavarian army during the war, he rose to the rank of corporal, operating as a runner. Hitler was wounded twice and awarded the Iron Cross for his bravery, which fueled his sense of nationalism and purpose. As Germany faced defeat in 1918, the Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh reparations and territorial losses, leading to pervasive discontent amongst the German populace. Disillusioned and angry, Hitler returned to Munich, where he experienced the economic turmoil and rampant inflation that plagued post-war Germany. The once proud nation was now a fractured society, leaving many seeking answers and direction. Within this chaotic environment, Hitler found himself drawn to politics. Initially, he attended meetings of the German Workers' Party, or the DAP, a small nationalist group. His charisma and oratory skills quickly set him apart, and he soon became a prominent figure. By 1919, he was speaking passionately about military glory, national pride, and the perceived betrayal of the German people by the Weimar Republic and its leaders. Hitler's public speaking captivated audiences, and he painted a picture of a Germany that would reclaim its former greatness. In early 1920, the DAP renamed itself to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the NSDAP, to emphasize its focus on nationalism and socialism, appealing to the working class. Hitler took on the role of the party's chief propagandist, developing its ideology that combined extreme nationalism, anti-Semitism, and anti-communism. Throughout 1920, Hitler organized rallies and used propaganda to spread the party's message, emphasizing the need for a strong leader to restore Germany's honor and power. His dedication did not go unnoticed, and in 1921 he became the party's leader, uniting various factions under his strong leadership. He emphasized the idea of the Aryan race being superior, promoting troubling ideologies that would later manifest in very dark ways. Despite facing opposition and internal challenges, Hitler's strength as a speaker and his ability to tap into the collective frustration of the people allowed the NSDAP to gain membership and traction. His vision increasingly focused on the idea of creating a national community, which he believed could only be achieved through the exclusion of those he deemed inferior. In the early 1920s, the NSDAP started to gain political influence, winning seats in local elections. Fueled by the economic instability of the Weimar Republic, the party's popularity soared. Hitler capitalized on the fears and frustrations of the masses, promising solutions to unemployment, poverty, and national humiliation. By joining the NSDAP, Hitler didn't just become a member, he transformed it into a powerful political force. His leadership style was authoritative, and he demanded unwavering loyalty from his followers. The combination of his mesmerizing speeches, the party's propaganda, and the widespread discontent within the Weimar Republic paved the way for future ambitions. Hitler had played a minor role in the Kampf Putsch, but managed to avoid attention from the authorities. Feeling dissatisfied with the progress made by Gustav Witte von Kahr, in a larger national push attempt, Hitler and his followers, known as the Kampfbund, decided to take matters into their own hands in Bavaria. In November of 1923, Hitler, Erich von Ludendorff, and the Kampfbund initiated a plan. At this point, Ludendorff fully supported the Nazi Party's objectives, having been one of the originators of the stab-in-the-back myth, which was crucial to Hitler's ideology. The stab-in-the-back myth had emerged in post-World War I Germany as a narrative to explain the nation's defeat and the perceived betrayal by various groups. Ludendorff had played a crucial role in the German military strategy during the war, promoting the idea that the German army had not been defeated on the battlefield, but rather had been betrayed by civilians at home, particularly socialists, Jews, and politicians. This belief suggested that these groups were responsible for undermining the war effort, thus contributing to Germany's surrender in November of 1918. Ludendorff's promotion of the myth aimed to shift blame away from the military leaders, such as himself, and to delegitimize the newly established Weimar Republic. He argued that the German military was still capable of winning the war, having been effective in all the battles up until the final stages, and that it was the actions of politicians and activists, particularly those advocating for peace negotiations, that had actually led to Germany's capitulation. This narrative resonated strongly with many Germans who were disillusioned by the war's outcome and the harsh conditions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. The myth played a significant role in fostering extreme nationalist sentiments and was embraced by various far-right groups, including the Nazis. Hitler and the others used this myth to galvanize support, depicting themselves as defenders of the stabbed army and seeking to restore national pride and unity by blaming scapegoats for Germany's misfortunes. This provided a foundation for anti-Semitism and to help justify subsequent political actions taken by the Nazi regime. It was November the 8th of 1923, a chilly evening in Munich. The streets were alive with chatter as citizens filled local taverns, desperate to escape the harsh realities of their lives. Amongst these venues was the Bürgerbräukeller, a large beer hall known for its political gatherings. That night, it would be host to an event that would forever alter the course of German history. Hitler's NSDAP orchestrated a plan to seize power in Bavaria, using the beer hall as a base of operations. At the time, Hitler believed that the political climate was favorable for a putsch. The government was weak, and various factions were embroiled in conflict. It seemed the perfect moment to strike. As the night wore on, Hitler, alongside his cadre of stormtroopers, stormed into the hall where dignitaries were listening to speeches. He raised his gun and declared, "The National Revolution has begun." The proclamation shocked the attendees and created a frantic atmosphere. Amongst them were influential local leaders like Gustav von Kahr, the state commissioner, and General Otto von Lossow, the head of the army in Bavaria. Hitler and his supporters took the key political figures captive, promising them deals that would benefit their interests if they sided with them. Despite the temporary control, Karl Lossow and the third figure, Hans Frank, were not intimidated. Hitler demanded they submit to him and his new revolutionary government. Kahr and the others refused, leading to the putsch's unraveling. Hitler's SA members attempted to secure weapons from local armories but failed to convince the Reichswehr garrison to defect, which put them in a precarious situation. As various crises began to unfold across the city, amidst his men's struggles, Hitler left the beer hall to address an issue elsewhere. This decision proved to be quite the mistake. As soon as Hitler left, Ludendorff allowed the captives to go free, as they promised not to alarm the authorities. And this would enable someone like Kahr to rally resistance against the putsch and connect it with his supporters. By the end of the first night, it was evident that the putsch was nearly doomed. Outside the beer hall, news of the putsch spread rapidly, and police forces and military units began mobilizing to restore order. In a desperate bid to consolidate his power, Hitler called for a march through Munich to demonstrate his strength and rally support. As Hitler and his small army of supporters marched, they found that the streets were now devoid of resistance. The local police had positioned themselves to intercept the march outside the Frauenhalle, a monument honoring Bavarian soldiers. On the morning of November the 9th of 1923, the march reached its climax at the Frauenhalle. Thousands of onlookers gathered, some curious, others supportive, but many quite hostile. The police stood firm in their position, ready to defend the democratic order. The standoff led to a tense confrontation. As Hitler urged his followers to charge, the police opened fire. The sound of gunfire shattered the morning calm as chaos erupted. Several of Hitler's supporters were killed or wounded, and within moments the coup imploded. Hitler himself was struck in the leg, falling to the ground amidst the pandemonium. Realizing that the putsch had failed, he attempted to flee, but it was far too late. The police effectively quashed the attempted coup, captured or killed many of the insurgents. The aftermath of the Beerhall Putsch saw Hitler take on a fugitive role. He managed to evade capture initially, blending into the chaotic streets of Munich. However, this period of hiding was short-lived. Only a few days later, he was arrested along with other leaders of the coup. Hitler was charged with treason, and his trial became a high-profile event that garnered significant media attention. Rather than hiding in shame, he used the platform as an opportunity to air his grievances against the Weimar Republic and express his vision for Germany's future. While serving a sentence of 5 years at Landsberg prison, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, outlining his ideology, including themes of nationalism, anti-Semitism, and the concept of Lebensraum, or living space. He firmly believed that the Aryan race was destined to rule and that the Treaty of Versailles had humiliated Germany. Although he was sentenced to 5 years, public opinion had shifted considerably by the time he was released, after serving just 9 months. Rather than being seen as a failed insurgent, he emerged as a national figure promising to restore Germany to its former glory. The Beerhall Putsch was a significant turning point in both Hitler's life and the trajectory of Germany. Although the coup failed, it was instrumental in shaping the narrative that would help cement Hitler's power in the years to come. The putsch illuminated the vulnerabilities of the Weimar Republic and highlighted the growing discontent amongst its populace. In the years that followed, Hitler and the Nazi Party would work diligently to exploit the political instability and economic despair that plagued Germany. They used propaganda to rewrite the failure of the putsch as a noble attempt to save the nation from the hands of traitors and communists, ultimately transforming their image into that of saviors, striving for national unity. The reverberations of the Beerhall Putsch were felt far beyond its immediate aftermath. It paved the way for the Nazis to gain legitimacy and ultimately seize power in 1933, leading to one of history's darkest chapters, the rise of totalitarianism, brutal repression, and the horror of World War II. Now I want to shift back over to the German armed forces. In the 1920s, the Reichswehr was heavily involved in said putsches as well as others, suppressing them and engaging playfully with the Republican government. When not occupied with these activities, the army focused on upholding a semblance of professionalism within its treaty-restricted forces. The Treaty of Versailles imposed strict limitations on the German military. Here is a rough breakdown of said limitations. Germany's army was limited to 100,000 troops, significantly reduced from over 2 million before the war. This restriction aimed to curtail its capacity for large-scale mobilization. The treaty prohibited conscription, meaning that Germany could not draft citizens into the military service, further limiting manpower. Germany was forbidden from possessing tanks, aircraft, and submarines. The treaty also restricted the size and armament of its naval forces to a fleet of 6 battleships. The Rhineland region was demilitarized, preventing German military presence in the strategically important area bordering France. Germany was prohibited from forming military alliances or participating in any future military collaboration that could threaten other countries. Thus being capped at 100,000 personnel, they were organized into 7 infantry divisions, with 3 cavalry divisions intended to comprise the entire military with no trained reserves. However, the state's maintenance of the Freikorps completely violated these restrictions, yet the Allies chose to ignore this. The general staff system, a hallmark of the Prussian and German armies since the Napoleonic era, was dismantled. In its place, German generals devised ways to retain the essence of the general staff without the official title. Amongst these generals, Hans von Seeckt and Walter Reinhardt were particularly influential in this effort. They successfully advocated for a more streamlined general staff system under the War Ministry's Troop Office, allowing the new army to preserve its leadership and continue the professional development of its officers. Now, in the previous podcast, we focused on the collaboration between the German and Soviet armies and their defensive industries during the mid-1920s. This time we will revisit this cooperation, but from the German point of view. The Soviets sought technical know-how, designs, and manufacturing equipment, while the Germans had quite different objectives. They were primarily interested in the Soviet Union's vast territory and its isolation from Western allies and their prying eyes. These characteristics provided the Germans with an opportunity to experiment with new concepts and formations without attracting attention to their rearmament efforts. Such experiments would lay the groundwork for mobile warfare tactics in the upcoming conflict. Something very important to note about the German military at this time. During World War I, Germany engaged the Entente powers in the Western Front in what became known as trench warfare. World War I trench warfare was characterized by extensive use of trenches to protect soldiers from enemy fire and to create a static front line. This warfare style emerged in 1914 on the Western Front, where opposing forces dug intricate networks of trenches stretching from the North Sea all the way to Switzerland. These trenches varied in depth, structure, including front lines, support, and reserve trenches, interconnected by communication trenches. Life in the trenches was harsh and brutal. Soldiers faced constant threats from enemy bombardments, sniper fire, and poison gas attacks, which introduced new horrors to the battlefield conditions. They dealt with poor sanitation, mud, vermin, and extreme weather, leading to diseases like trench foot. The psychological toll was immense, as soldiers endured prolonged periods of boredom punctuated by intense periods of combat. Offensive strategies often resulted in heavy casualties due to the fortified nature of the enemy positions. Notable battles such as the Battle of the Somme or the Battle of Verdun saw millions of soldiers become casualties while making almost no territorial gains. Now, while this was almost the exclusive experience for Britain, France, and other Entente powers in the Western Front, Germany also fought in the Eastern Front. On the Eastern Front, the conflict did not devolve into trench warfare, as both the German and Russian armies engaged in a war of movement across vast distances. This experience granted the German leadership insights that were not accessible to their trench-bound Western enemies. Research on operations in the East concluded that smaller, coordinated forces were more effective in combat than larger, uncoordinated ones. After the war, the Reichswehr expanded and refined its infiltration tactics. Chief Commander Hans von Seeckt noted that there had been too much emphasis on encirclement and highlighted the importance of speed instead. He played a key role in revising the concept von Bewegungskrieg, maneuver warfare, and its related Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, where commanders communicated their objectives to subordinates while allowing them freedom to decide how to achieve said goals. The guiding principle was that the higher the authority, the more general the orders. It was up to the lower levels to provide the necessary details. Executing higher-level orders was still bounded by the training doctrine of elite officer corps. The delegation of the authority to local commanders accelerated the pace of operations, significantly contributing to the success of German forces in the earlier stages of the war. Emphasizing the Prussian tradition of mobility, Seeckt transformed the German army into a more agile force and championed technological advancements that enhanced its capabilities, improving coordination amongst motorized infantry, tanks, and aircraft. Thus, Germany kind of got the best of both worlds in World War I and heavily benefited from their wartime experience. At the Joint Training Center at Kampf, the Reichswehr began testing armored maneuvers and recognized the critical role of radios in conducting these operations. This experience, combined with training exercises and war games held in Germany, contributed to the development of combined motorized infantry and armored division doctrine. This innovative formation didn't differ significantly from the armored forces of World War I, but it was still ahead of its time. As early as 1917, there had been some professional literature on the subject, particularly that of J.F.C. Fuller's presentations to the American Expeditionary Board, which outlined an early concept of combined arms mechanized cavalry units. Throughout the 1920s, armies around the world explored the potential of larger armored units, but it still remains a bit unclear who originated the concept. What is evident is that the German army was experimenting with this idea at Kampf by the late 1920s, although technological and industrial capabilities had not yet caught up with those intellectual pursuits. The exercises at Kampf utilized the Leichttraktor, an experimental light tank with various designs produced by different manufacturers. These tanks were basic, even by the era standards, and they were never intended for combat, serving primarily as training vehicles. However, they did introduce integrated radios for tank use. The collaboration at Kampf proved to be quite beneficial, enabling both armies to grasp essential lessons needed for the next war. During the 1920s, the German army focused more on developing a theory of combined arms mobility than on creating any particular weapon system. They practiced and refined their concept of mobile warfare, where motorized infantry and cavalry would infiltrate deep in enemy territory through army war games. The officers aimed to foster a culture of offensive spirit at both the tactical and operational levels. This approach contrasted sharply with the French military, which was beginning to adopt a defensive mindset and ultimately led to a significant failure in World War II. While both armies had endured the harsh realities of trench warfare, they drew very different conclusions. The First World War taught the French that maintaining a strong, continuous defensive line was nearly impossible to achieve. In contrast, the Germans learned that constant movement was essential to countering the propensity for large armies to become entrenched in positional warfare. These conflicting perspectives arose from extensive debate shaped by each nation's experiences, cultures, and strategic outlooks. Throughout the 1920s, the Reichswehr sought to refine its tactics to align with the nation's strategic objectives. The German Navy was effectively dismantled following its defeat in 1918. It faced losses to every significant battle, lost all of its major ships, and was restricted by treaties from even constructing its most effective weapon, that being the U-boat. During this period, there were two competing ideologies. as was common amongst European navies. Unlike in the Soviet Union, the German Navy did not have a clear winner amongst these ideologies. There was no single overarching doctrine guiding acquisitions and tactics. Instead, the continuous competition created a fragmented fleet that was never fully committed to any one approach. The Commerce Rating School, similar to the Jeune d'École doctrine, discussed in the previous podcast, was further split into two factions. One who advocated for heavy surface raiders, and the other focusing on U-boats as a primary force. Many key figures throughout the interwar period supported the U-boat faction, with Admiral Hermann Bauer establishing its intellectual groundwork. Eventually, Karl Donitz emerged as the leading proponent of the U-boat strategy, although his influence over the Navy's direction didn't significantly increase until the 1940s, when Hitler sanctioned the Wehrmacht's commitment to submarines as a viable weapon. The other faction within the Commerce Rating School was known as the Cruiserkrieg, or Cruiser War. This concept was exemplified by the construction of the renowned Panzerschiff in the late 1920s. These vessels were designed from the ground up to be fast, heavily armed commerce raiders capable of entering the Atlantic and beyond, causing disruption to global shipping. Interestingly, the Panzerschiff concept, which was thoroughly modernized, had its origin in pre-Napoleonic era. The first ships of the U.S. Navy were swift, heavily armed frigates, meant to outpace slower ships of the line and target weaker merchant vessels and their escorts, just as the Panzerschiff would do about 150 years later. This school of thought dominated German naval doctrine during the interwar years until Admiral Eilfrede took command of the Navy in 1928. Random note here, over on my personal podcast, known as Echoes of War, me and my co-host ran a 4-part series talking about who we thought were the best and worst generals, admirals, and air commanders of World War II. Just wanted to say, for Germany, Eilfrede certainly made the worst list. He really greatly hampered Germany's U-boat development program. Seriously, the guy was a moron. Even when you compare him to an even dumber guy like Hermann Göring. But I desist. Also, if any of you listeners play World of Warships like I do, yeah, I like my Bismarck and all that, but boy oh boy, what a colossal waste of money for Germany. Now from that point on, the Navy focused on developing Raeder's favored battleship fleet, reminiscent of the Imperial German Navy. His leadership saw the construction of the Scharnhorst and the Bismarck classes, and the design of the enormous H-class super battleships. These ambitious designs, some weighing as much as 140,000 tons, represented the ultimate vision of Raeder's battleship navy, and wasted so much of Germany's money. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released a rather hilarious episode looking at the wacky and crazed world of Chinese World War II dramas. Over on Echoes of War, we're releasing a 5-part series covering the Malayan campaign of World War II. If you'd like to further support me personally, consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. In post-World War I Germany, chaos reigned as societal unrest ignited revolutionary fever. Amidst the political chaos, Hitler rose, promising restoration amidst disillusionment. The failed Beerhall Putsch marked a turning point, catalyzing his ascent. As the fragile Weimar Republic grappled with internal strife, the Reichswehr evolved, foreshadowing future conflicts.